So I recently found an old friend on TikTok, and she made a really good point about how Book Talk is talking a lot about banned books. And she asked me if I was planning on doing a video on any banned books. But I told her no, because it felt like a lot of people were already doing that. So instead, I'm gonna give you a list of 10 books slash articles that you can read to read more diversely, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And here's my certification. I graduated with an English degree in multicultural US literature. So I fear I am a little qualified to give you some really good diverse reads. And I also minored in history, which is important. So here are the 10. I did some fiction and I did some nonfiction. Most of the nonfiction are, they slam on my door, are articles. So it is what it is. So the number one book that I could recommend, that if you want to read more diversely or you feel like you just want to be more informed, number one, American Indian Stories by Zitkala Shah. That book, I literally read it like 4 times at my time, like in my degree seeking process, and it didn't hit me until the 4th time I read it what it was about and why it was important to read it. It's about a woman who, she grew up on a Native American tribe reservation, and she was taken away from her family to live in a residential school, and she later becomes a very well-known author and poet. And it's more of a memoir, but it can be read as fiction, but it's more of a memoir. And she just goes through her experience on the reservation at the beginning of her life, what it was like being persecuted and abused in the residential school, and then later in life once she graduated and she realized how traumatic her childhood was, and what they did to her mother. And it's just a heart-wrenching book. But I think that with all of the discussion going around about banned books and that content of what is in those banned books, this is a really good book to focus on, because it's not just about it being a banned book. This book has been a monolith in my education, and I feel like it's not talked about enough. Number 2 is On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. It is about a person who is very similar to the author himself, but it's not necessarily like a self-narrated story. And it is essentially going through his life as an Asian American person, and talking about him coming out and having his feelings of being queer. And it's a very beautiful story, but you kind of do have to get through it, because Ocean Vuong is a poet, so it is a more poetic prose rather than prose fiction. The next book I want to talk about, I read this in a poetry course that I was taking with my advisor, and I hated poetry before I took this course. But this book was the first book that we read in that class, and it has stuck with me since. It is called Deaf Republic. It is about a revolution that begins because a deaf child is killed in the middle of, I believe it is Ukraine, Russia occupied Ukraine, and how a town rises up because a child was killed by Russian soldiers. It's an amazing story, and I think I still have some notes in here from it, but it is a story about resistance and coming together as a community, even if that means really, really bad things have to happen for you to overthrow an oppressor. The next one is I've Been a Woman by Sonia Sanchez. I also read this in the poetry course. However, this was like an independent project, and it is about a Black woman. And I think it's like a memoir type piece, but the main character is not specifically said to be the author. But it's basically about being a Black woman in America in like the 70s and 80s, and talking about abusive relationships, how Black men see Black women, and thanks, bestie. Okay. It's about how Black men see Black women, and kind of just giving Black women the strength to use their words about abusive relationships. And it's about a lot of other things, but that's mostly what I took from it. The next book is a book that I got in London, actually, when I was studying abroad, and it really opened my eyes to history in London. And I feel like British history, the mainstream British history, is very whitewashed, but the more you dive into the academic British history, that's where it becomes more diverse, especially in London. So this next one is called Black Tudors, and it is essentially debunking the myth that Black people were all slaves in the medieval Tudor era. And it tells the story of 10 Black people who were very prominent in their time, and even a woman who owned her own land, and she lived in a village by herself, and she lived very happily. So I think this is a great read for people who really enjoy nonfiction, but also for people who are looking to feel like they want to read something historical about Black people who are not just slaves, or who weren't just fighting for civil rights. Like, this has stories about a trumpeter, and it has stories about the lady who owned her own land, and it's just a bunch of different stories in here, and it has historical documents to back it all up. And then there's also pictures in the middle of said famous Black people. I like this one a lot. But yeah, it shows a different side of history that I feel like mainstream history doesn't talk about. So this next book, I don't remember if it's fiction or nonfiction, but I'm almost certain it is fiction, but it is based off of a real person, but I believe it is fiction. I read this book while I was doing a project in London with my detective fiction class, and it is called Dora Bruder by Patrick Modiano. And it is about a young girl in occupied Paris, Nazi occupied Paris, and about trying to figure out if she was gassed or not. And it's kind of it's more of a speculative mystery novel, and it gets very deep into Jewish history, and talking about that time and what it meant to be Jewish even in a free country such as Paris. So I feel like it's very on the nose for where we are headed in this country. And I think it's a very great book to read, just to start talking about occupations, if you know what I mean. Number 7 is an article by Caitlin Fitz, I believe. It is called It is called Latin America and the it is called Latin America and the Radicalization of the U.S. Abolition of U.S. abolition. It is an article that basically talks about a Brazilian man who helped catalyze the abolitionist movement. I mean, he doesn't take credit for starting the abolitionist movement, but is talking about how stuff like the Haitian Revolution and the American Revolution helped to inspire Latin American people and specifically radicalize some rebels in Latin America, and how one of those rebels came back to the US and realized, all of the people aren't free, so what was that revolution for? The cats are fighting. Anyway, it basically radicalized this man named Emiliano, and he goes to the US to basically be like, hey, you know, y'all all aren't free. We need to get back on this. We need to remember what the revolution was about and free all the people, not just the white people. The next book that I think, if you call yourself a feminist, everyone should read this book, is The Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. She is the mother of one of my favorite authors, Mary Shelley, and she basically does a similar thing as Emiliano, and she kind of radicalizes the feminist movement in revolutionary France and England. So I believe the context is the French Revolution is like starting, like there's machinations happening, there's conversations happening, and she is writing all these pamphlets and like, hey, you guys want to have your little meetings and talk about how we should be free from the monarchy. What are you going to do with the women? What's going on here? Like, women should be able to work. They should be able to choose whether they want to be a mother. They should be a part of the discussion on their freedoms just as much as you have your freedoms. And this is my baby girl. Hi, baby. And she basically just kind of like has a feud with one of the French thinkers. I don't even remember his name. He's that insignificant to me. But she's basically having this feud, and then she writes The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which I believe is like a reference to The Vindication of the Rights of Man, and it kind of goes point for point with why if men should be free, then women should also be free. Now, this is especially for the straight allies, okay? Because I feel like a lot of the queer girlies have already read this. And I don't know if this is, you know, very mainstream, but I think pretty much everyone, whether they have queer friends, they are queer themselves, or they are, my God, calling themselves allies, should read the Comp Het Lesbian Master Doc. Now, technically, this is not an academic piece. However, I feel like it has a great discussion on the patriarchy and how it has messed with our heads and how it looks in everyday life, even for queer people. And this is especially true for women who found out they were queer later in life. But two of my friends read this and then they were like, I do center men a lot in my life. And they kind of just like reworked themselves. And I also feel like it's very beneficial, not just to figure out, you know, queer sexuality, but also to rewrite that patriarchal narrative for yourself, especially if you're a woman. So this doesn't have to be like a revolutionary queer coming of age moment, but I think everyone should read it if they want to learn more about the queer mindset and about queer peoples. Last but not least, and this is probably going to be like 3 or 4 videos, I think everyone should read Beloved by Toni Morrison. I did. I know everyone's talking about The Bluest Eye or Sula. We should be reading Beloved, because that book is about Black motherhood, and it is about just the hatred of Black women, essentially. It follows a newly freed woman, and she kind of hides her children away. Well, she's not newly freed. She ran away, and she has children. And her old owner finds out that she has children, and he basically comes for them, because if you don't already know, the lineage of slavery follows the line of the mother, not the father. So if the father had a child, if a Black man had a child with a white woman, more likely than not, the child would be killed, but that child could be free because the lineage followed the mother, not the father. So Beloved basically talks about how slavery traumatizes people, and how a system like that doesn't just go away for one person, and the generational trauma of slavery. And it also was basically a speculative nonfiction, because she based it off of a true story of a real Black woman, and she did so much research about it. So I think that would be a really great read, especially if you want to read more Black authors. This list of books is just my personal opinion. A great start for reading diversely and understanding the America that we live in. I believe all of these books, except for Dora Bruder and The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, were all written and worked out by Americans and talking about American society, but I feel like all of them do a really good job of stepping into reality and talking about the different facets of the American patriarchy. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any more questions about like academic books, because I feel like not a lot of people talk about academic books, I kind of would love to go back more into my academia girly era. So let me know if you have any questions, start a discussion in the comments, and I will try and put those articles, or if I can find links to the books that you can download, in my link tree. So look out for that, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!